FCBARB. As the Rector Pancasila University, Vice Rector 3rd and 4th of Pancasila University. Ms. Grace Clegg as the Assistant Cultural Attaché from U.S. Embassy Republic of Indonesia. Mr. Gregory B.Poling as a Senior Fellow and Director Southeast Asia Program Initiative. Bapak Haris Nugroho SH LL.M as the National of Law Pancasila. We would also like to welcome our moderator webinar, Mr. Mulya Wirana as International Office Pancasila.
Before we start today's event, please let us first read the rule. First, to all the honorable guests and participants present in the room, please turn off your mobile or put it during the event. Second, all the honorable guests and who attended virtually via online Zoom meeting during the event. Third, the present guided our moderator, Mr. Ambassador Mulya Wirana, SH, Pancasila University. Fourth, all the honorable participants joined virtually via the presence given by the committee via the chat box.
Without any further ado, let's start the first session of this, which is welcome of the Dean of Law Pancasila. Please welcome Bapak Professor Dr. Eddy who joined via virtually Zoom meeting. The screen is yours, sir.
I thank you very much, Ibu Arum. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan, dan salam Pancasila. Good morning, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, especially the Honorable Rector of the University of Pancasila. First of all, I would like to express my sincere gratitude and appreciations to Professor Dr. Eddy Hendratno, M.Si FCBARB for his coming to this international webinar. And I would like also to take this opportunity to express my appreciations to the representatives of the United States Embassy in Jakarta and all the speakers, dear participants who are in the Zoom and in the room. This international webinar on maritime security and the law of the sea with the topic on how to manage and mitigate the tensions and conflict on the South China Sea, hopefully will promote the role of the higher education, including this university, by involving academia, scholars, diplomats, and practitioners who have expertise and special knowledge and experience in the law of the sea to express and develop the law of the sea and its challenges ahead, particularly relating to maritime security in the South China Sea. Let me take this opportunity to thank very much to the U.S. Embassy in Jakarta for collaborating with us, the Faculty of Law, University of Pancasila, in order to educate not only the students, but maybe lecturers can also gain new knowledge and understanding by watching this international webinar. Special thanks to Mr. Gregory B.Poling, his senior fellow and director of Southeast Asia program and Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative of CSIS as one of our speakers today. Thank you for your willingness, Mr. Gregory, for sharing your knowledge with us today. One of the challenges that we are facing today of the UNCLOS, among others, is in the South China Sea, maritime area as the crucial commercial doorway for a great number of global commercial sea transports. And it is important economic and strategic of the sub-region of the Indo-Pacific. But on the other hand, it is also the hotspot of multiple complicated territorial claims by several nations, including the nation of the Southeast Asia. The topic of the South China Sea claim by several member countries is very much important to be discussed, especially in this very seminar and webinar. It is so many questions that need to be answered by all of us, especially related to the South China Sea situations and especially in relevance with the maritime security. There are many questions. For example, what is the core problem of the South China Sea in current days? And how do we define the 9-line claim that is being put forward by Chinese? What is the overlapping claim that means under the international law, especially UNCLOS? We need to answer those questions. And I'm quite happy that today we will have two speakers. Number one is Pak Haris Nugroho and Mr. Gregory, who will raise and respond to the question that I have just put forward just now. And it is very important for all of us to discuss and develop the issue of maritime security within the sub-region of Southeast Asia. Without further ado, I would like to invite all participants to watch and listen very carefully the presentation that is going to be made by two speakers. But before that, I would like this time to invite Pak Rektor, Professor Dr. Eddy Hendratno, M.Si FCBARB, to give us a speech and open the seminar. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much for Bapak Profesor Dr. Eddy Pratomo, SHMA, for the welcoming remarks. And now we're proceeding to the next agenda, is listening to the opening remarks from the Rector of Pancasila University. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bapak Profesor Dr. Eddy Hendratno, SHMA, FCBARB. The floor is yours, sir.
The very good morning to all of you. especially Mr. Gregory B.Poling and also Miss Grace, but also Pira Findiarta. Today, I see that the top official of this university also attend on this meeting. The is Mr. Nugroho. He was he was a police general. The second from right is he was the third is Miss Putri Langka. He is the vice cooperation and the last is Mr. Rana. International relationship. Behind you is the Dean of Faculty of Engineering, Mr. Dean of the. He was also ex-minister. And then who else? The other is my lovely student. I heard that also coming from another university. Is that right? Hello, MC?
Yes, sir.
All from University of Pancasila, or there's also from other university? The student.
The student is from International Law Department, sir.
Oh, I see. All of our family.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Welcome. Welcome to Mr. Gregory B.Poling to my campus. Since I was a kid, name Gregory always on my mind. Why? Because I admire the artist from United States, Gregory Peck. Do you know that? Yeah, maybe you were born yet. That time. He's very handsome. I think he's not exist anymore. Allow me expressing my appreciation to Ambassador Professor Eddy Pratomo, Dean of the Faculty of Law, University Pancasila, who has initiated this important international webinar on maritime security and the law of the sea with the topic how to manage and mitigate conflict in tension in the South China Sea. This webinar is held by the Faculty of Law, University of Pancasila, as part of our series of events conducted in our campus to expand cooperation with foreign counterpart, including with the United States Embassy in Jakarta. We knew Emily since 1 year ago. Send my regard to Emily. In this regard, I'm particularly thankful to the United States Embassy, who has been kindly supported us by jointly organizing this international webinar and also inviting Mr. Greg B.Poling as one of our speakers today. My particular appreciation goes to Mr. Greg B.Poling, a senior fellow and director, Southeast Asia Program and Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative of CSIS, for taking his time to share his knowledge and experience at this webinar. ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants. International law, including law of the sea, do not grow up in isolation. They are influenced by politics, economics, and geography of the real world to which they apply. If we look at the development of the law of the sea from the early 18th century up to the end of the 19th century, the seas were largely subject to a laissez-faire regime. The high seas were open to free and unrestricted use by all. Such a regime reflected the interest of dominant European powers of the period in promoting seaborne trade and maintaining communication with their colonies. In the second half of the 20th century, the premises upon which the laissez-faire regime rested underwent a fundamental change. The traditional hegemony of the European state was challenged both by the emergence of the two superpower USA and USSR, and by the nationalism and demand for economic autonomy of the developing countries. Most of them gained their independence after the Second World War, including Indonesia. In the modern era, the uses of the sea multiplied and intensified as a result of development in technology, increasing demand of natural resources, which increased possibilities for conflict. The South China Sea contains rich of living and non-living resources and is reported to hold reserve of undiscovered oil and gas, which is an intensifying factor in maritime and in territorial disputes. The major island and reef information in South China Sea are the Spratly Island, Parallel Island, Pratas, the Natuna Islands, and Scarborough Shoal. Overlapping claims of the territorial sovereignty over islands and other maritime features in the South China Sea have been the enduring source of tension and distrust in the region. Again, this backdrop, I am hopeful that through this seminar, the participant will be able to gain knowledge and experience from the distinguished speakers of this maritime security issue, particularly in the South China Sea. Before I conclude my remarks, let me extend my sincere hope that you will enjoy this seminar. I'm very much grateful to all of you, the distinguished speaker and participant, for the tremendous support which makes this seminar possible. Thank you for your participation.
Thank you very much, Bapak Profesor Dr. Eddy Hendratno, SH, M.Si, FCBARB, for the opening remarks, sir.
And now we will hold a photo session. To all the honorable speakers and also the rector of Pancasila University and the representative from the U.S. Embassy, please come forward. To all participants who are present via Zoom meeting, to please open your camera so we can take the photograph.
We ask also the vice rectors and the vice deans of Faculty of Law Pancasila University to come forward.
We would like to ask help from the cameraman and the technician to give the signal. Thank you.
And also Professor Ade Saptomo as the head of Magister of Law Pancasila University.
To everyone, you can go back to your place. Thank you.
And now we'll be entering to the main agenda, the presentation by the speakers that will be guided by Mr. Ambassador Mulya Wirana SH. We would like to remind all participants, both in the room and the Zoom meeting, to continue to comply with the rules. To all speakers and moderator, please come forward to the stage. The floor is yours, sir.
A very good morning to all of you. My name is Mulya Wirana. I'm the Deputy Head of the International Office of the University of Pancasila. It is indeed a great honor and to be here today for this seminar or webinar and how to manage and mitigate conflict and tension in South China Sea. And I think, first of all, we have to thank the Honorable Rector, Professor Dr. Eddy Hendratno, M.Si, FCBARB, for his important remarks. And also we thank Professor Dr. Eddy Pratomo, SHMA, the Dean of the Faculty of Law, who is also the host and initiator of this important event. And last but not least, our appreciation, of course, goes to the United States Embassy in Jakarta, who is now represented by Ms. Grace Kleck, the Assistant Cultural Attaché from the Embassy. And of course, as you all know, we have two distinguished speakers present with us today. First of all, Mr. Gregory, the Senior Fellow and Director of South Asia Program and Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative. And the second speaker is Mr. Haris Nugroho, who also will touch on the matter today. So without further ado, let's hear first of all the presentation of Mr. Gregory B.Poling. I think I just already give a short introduction. You are from your CV, you are focused on Southeast Asia, and you also focus on foreign policy in the Asia Pacific. And we would like very much from you and how you see the development of this issue on the South China Sea. I think I give you the floor. Please.
Well, thank you so much. Selamat pagi to the Universitas Pancasila, Faculty of Law, and the U.S. Embassy for helping bring me out. Thank you so much. As stated, my name is Gregory B.Poling. I direct the Southeast Asia program and what we call the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, which for the last 8 years has focused on monitoring activity in Asia's disputed waters, mostly in the South China Sea. So any time you see satellite imagery of China's island building in the Spratlys, or about China Coast Guard harassing Indonesian drilling operations as a tuna block off Natuna Besar, that usually comes from my team. Today, I'm going to focus my remarks around my recently published book that you see the cover of here, which is called On Dangerous Grounds. The title, of course, is a reference to the fact that the Spratly Islands on most maritime charts for about 200 years was simply identified as dangerous ground, an area to be avoided because of the frequency of shipwrecks. Subtitle is America's Century in the South China Sea, because that is how long the United States government has been directly involved in one way or another in the disputes around the South China Sea. Now, U.S. interests, national interests in the South China Sea disputes have been largely unchanged for that entire century. The United States has maintained two core national interests, and one of them is shared with Indonesia. So the first is defense of U.S. alliances. The United States
Masih ada satu lagi.
Sea,
Itu ada.
its
Satu
colonization of the Philippines, and then remain there because of its alliance with the Philippines, as well as the alliances with the Republic of China and the Republic of Vietnam and South Vietnam, all of which were occupying the Spratlys. So for much of the last 100 years, U.S. interest in the South China Sea has partly been about maintaining its alliance commitments, its credibility to defend allies and partners. And that, of course, remains true today as the Philippines faces persistent threats of violence from China. The second U.S. interest in the South China Sea, and the one that's is defense of freedom of the seas, of international maritime law. The United States was born as a maritime trading nation. From its earliest days, the United States viewed defense of free sea lanes, the ability to trade, fish, and sail the oceans freely, as a fundamental national interest, without which the nation couldn't survive. And so, as claims in the South China Sea have evolved in ways that threaten international maritime law, the United States has asserted its rights, believing that no nation has the right to claim the open oceans. Can we go to the next slide? So, to frame the disputes in the South China Sea, talking about two different kinds of disputes. We have a territorial dispute over 4 island groups: the Spratly Islands, the Paracel Islands, Scarborough Shoal, and Pratas Reef. The United States does not care who owns which rock or reef. In this, we have the exact same position as the government of Indonesia. The United States has always maintained that it is neutral on questions of territorial sovereignty. But the United States has also maintained that those questions cannot be solved by violence. The United States will never accept the right of China or anybody else to use force to resolve the territorial disputes, because the other claimants are either U.S. allies or U.S. partners. The second dispute in the South China Sea is the dispute over maritime rights. How are the waters, the seabed, and the airspace to be governed? And there, the United States has a direct interest. The rules, as codified in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, apply to everyone. We were all there to help write them. China's claim, as shown by the 9 line here, to waters 1,000 miles and more south of China is illegal. And if China is allowed to claim 5 times more water than any other country on Earth just because it has bigger boats, then there is no such thing as maritime law. If the laws don't apply to everybody, they don't apply at all. This is also the place where US and Indonesian national interests in the South China Sea most clearly intersect, because Indonesia has, for the last 30 years, admitted that Chinese claims illegally violate Indonesia's exclusive economic zone. And like the United States, Indonesia was there when these rules were written. Leaders from Indonesia had a key hand in helping craft international maritime law as we know it today. Can we go to the next slide? Sorry, I have to lean out because I can't see what slide we're on. Okay. Hello? Okay, well, to very quickly run through the history here. For most of human history, nobody claimed any of the islands of the South China Sea. It would have been crazy to even think about it. These are unoccupied spits of land that have never been used by anybody but local fishermen and occasionally smugglers. The first claim of any sort to any of the islands in the South China Sea came from the Vietnamese. Ambassador Gia Long of the Nguyen Dynasty in 1816 annexed the Paracel Islands, and Vietnam began to use them to make money, mostly in salvage operations. That claim was largely forgotten during the latter 19th century, and the claims as we know them today started in 1909. In 1909, the Republic of China government annexed the Paracels. The French chose not to object, but toyed with the idea that they would claim the Paracels themselves because they were the colonial power in Vietnam, and they wanted to extend the previous claim of the Vietnamese government. And then Japanese business interests moved in. So by the 1920s, you had China, Japan, and France all jostling for control of the Paracel Islands. The Spratly Islands remained wholly unclaimed. Nobody even knew where the Spratly Islands were for the most part. As I said, on all the maps in use in the world, essentially, the Spratly Islands were just a big box that said dangerous ground. Don't sail here, because nobody lives on them, but there's a whole lot of reefs that can wreck your boat. This only changed in 1933, which will be my next slide whenever we can get it up. In 1933, France annexed 7 of the Spratly Islands. This is because Japan had already been showing economic interest in the islands. When France annexed the islands in 1933, the Republic of China government made no objection. In fact, the government of the Republic of China went to the US Consul General in Manila and asked, hey, where are the Spratly Islands? And when the United States showed Chinese representative maps that showed that the Spratly Islands were not the same thing as the Paracels, China chose not to object. The government of Nanjing decided that China had no claim. So at this point, Chinese claims in the South China Sea were limited to only the Paracel Islands, and that would be the case throughout World War II and beyond. This also marked the first time that the Philippines toyed with its own claim. By 1937, Philippine Commonwealth officials were officially telling the press and the US State Department that they were going to claim the Spratly Islands on behalf of the Philippines, mostly because they wanted to keep the islands out of the hands of Japan. They worried that Japan would use the Spratlys to attack Philippine bases. Are we going to get the slides back? Okay. Here, islands France claim. Let's go to the next one. Yeah, we can go. I've already talked about this. We can go to this. Okay. In 1938, Japan invaded all of these islands. First, Japan set up naval bases on Woody Island and Lincoln Island in the Paracels, forcing France to respond by setting up a base on Patel Island. Then Japan set up a naval base down in the Spratlys on Ituaba. This is the first time that anybody really occupied the Spratlys. There had been a tiny number of Taiwanese and Japanese businessmen down there and a couple of French meteorologists studying the weather. But this Japanese occupation in 1938 was the first real time that the Spratlys were occupied. In 1939, France falls. In 1941, Japan invades the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, and British Malaya. And from that point until the end of the war, the South China Sea is a Japanese lake. The US position at this time is that Japanese claims in the South China Sea are illegal, not because the US cares who claims what rock, but because the way Japan went about it through violence was illegal. The US is officially neutral on whether or not any of these islands are owned by China, France, Vietnam, or the Philippines. And after World War II ends, when the San Francisco Peace Conference debates the ultimate sovereignty of all those territories that Japan seized, the fate of the Paracel and the Spratly Islands, the fate of all the South China Sea, is left undetermined. This is because the Allies disagreed. France wanted the islands back. The Soviets stood up for a claim by the People's Republic of China. And the US and the British remained neutral because both the Philippine and Republic of China governments wanted them. As a result, there's a race to reoccupy the islands. In 1947, the Republic of China sets up bases in the Paracels and in the Spratlys, at Woody Island and at Ituaba Island. This is the first time any Chinese official in recorded history ever stepped foot in the Spratly Islands, January of 1947. The French, because of these Chinese claims, decide to set up their own bases again in the half of the Paracels that are still empty. And that becomes the basis of the occupation of the Paracel Islands for the next 20 years. Can we flip to the next slide? Okay. Well, if you can make out here, by the 1950s, you have the Chinese forces set up on Woody Island, French forces, which then become Vietnamese bases on the other half of the Paracels. In 1951, the last bastion of nationalist power in China falls on Hainan, and as a result, the nationalists cannot keep any of these bases resupplied, so they leave. They pull out of both Ituaba and the Spratlys and out of Woody Island in the Paracels. And as a result, a few years later, the People's Republic of China, Communist China, quietly occupies Woody Island. That becomes the first base that Beijing holds in the Paracels. And that will hold until 1974, when China will decide to invade the Vietnamese bases on the western half of the Paracels. Let's flip to the next slide, please. Okay. The Spratly Islands remain unoccupied after 1951, after the Republic of China pulls out. Until in 1956, a private Philippine businessman by the name of Tomas Ploma decides that he's going to go out and he's going to claim the islands on behalf of the Philippine government with no permission from the government of the Philippines. So Tomas Ploma goes out in 1956 and he declares that he is claiming this box on behalf of the Philippine government, what he calls the province of Freedom Land. That box is almost identical to the claim that the French made back in 1933, except it excludes Spratly Island itself, includes everything else that everybody had ever claimed before that. The Philippine government officially rejects this claim. And President Ramon Magsaysay basically says that this guy, Tomas Ploma, is crazy. The Philippines is not claiming the island based on this. If the Philippines is going to claim the islands, they will claim it for their own reasons. But this makes the other claimants angry enough that it restarts the dispute. So as a result of Ploma's claim, the Republic of China comes and reoccupies Ituaba for the first time in 5 years. And that becomes the first permanent base in the Spratly Islands. The Taiwanese are still there today, almost 70 years later. And the Republic of Vietnam begins to undertake naval patrols around the Spratlys for the first time. The US position at this time is officially still neutrality, but it really wants to make sure that these three parties don't fight each other. Can we flip to the next slide, please? Thank you. The disputes in the South China Sea remain largely frozen until the late 1960s and early 1970s, because this is when oil and gas is first suspected in the island. So you've had these claims on paper by the Philippines, Vietnam, and the Republic of China all along, at least since the end of World War II, but none of them wanted to actually occupy any of the islands, except for the Taiwanese, the Republic of China on Ituaba. In 1968, a UN agency issues a report that says that they suspect that there might be oil and gas under the South China Sea. Now, keep in mind what else is happening in the international legal regime at this time. In 1958, the first UN Conference on the Law of the Sea had met and had agreed that there was a territorial sea that all countries were entitled to claim, and had agreed for the first time that there was this thing called the continental shelf. They didn't agree on how far it was, but everybody now knew that there was a thing called the continental shelf that allowed coastal states to claim oil and gas rights. You also had this emerging regime around islands. So in 1957, Indonesian Prime Minister Juanda Kartawijaya had been the first to claim archipelagic baselines. And he and the Philippine government had then pushed that in the UN conventions. So the idea that these islands might allow one to eventually claim oil and gas rights was in the air. It was worth consideration. In 1969, Indonesia and Malaysia negotiated a continental shelf boundary just to the south of this, so that both of them could begin to explore for oil and gas. And 10 years later, Indonesia issued the first offshore oil and gas license to American companies. So in the meantime, the Philippines and Vietnam want to get in on the action. The Marcos government in the Philippines decides that they are going to finally make good on these claims that Filipino officials have been kicking around since the 1930s. And in 1968, they go out and they look at the islands for the first time. And in 1970 and 1971, they occupy 5 of them. The Republic of Vietnam responds by occupying its first island. What is the U.S. position at this time? Neutrality, and insisting on peaceful resolution. Because if you look at this map, remember, this is 1973. All 3 of the countries claiming the Spratly Islands are U.S. treaty allies. The Republic of China and the Republic of the Philippines both have an Article 5 commitment from the United States to defend them from attack. What happens if they fight each other? Who is the United States supposed to defend? And the Republic of Vietnam is covered by the Manila Pact, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. So the United States is also required to defend Vietnam from aggression. So you can understand the only concern the U.S. has at this point is that these rocks not cause a larger war that would undermine the U.S. alliance system in Asia. The next slide, please. This radically changes a year later. In 1974, the People's Republic of China launches an invasion of the western half of the Paracel Islands. They defeat southern Vietnamese troops in a short naval battle, and then they capture almost 100 Vietnamese forces and 1 American who was out in the islands. A year later, Saigon falls in May of 1975. So as a result, the Philippines and the Republic of China are now worried that 1, Chinese forces, which just invaded the Paracels, are going to come down anytime and invade the Spratly Islands as well. And 2, all of the South Vietnamese bases in the Spratlys have now been replaced by North Vietnamese commandos. Can we flip to the next slide, please? The Philippines in particular believes that it is surrounded. A defector from Vietnam is taken to the Philippines and interrogated and tells the Philippine and American governments that North Vietnamese troops are planning an invasion of Philippine-held islands in the Spratlys. So now, all of a sudden in 1975, the Spratly Islands are no longer about keeping U.S. allies from fighting each other. They're about defending U.S. allies from potential aggression from either North Vietnam or China. The U.S. and the Philippines begin to debate the meaning of their treaty for the first time. The Marcos administration demands that the United States clarify that the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty applies to an attack in the South China Sea. And by 1979, the United States does this. The U.S. Secretary of State sends a letter to his counterpart in Manila clarifying that attacks that occur outside of the Philippines are still covered by the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty. Can we flip to the next slide, please? At the same time, the Philippines is also beginning to explore for oil and gas, just as Indonesia is at this time. So there is growing concern that China or Vietnam may attack Philippine drilling rigs. And so the U.S. has to clarify to the Philippines that, yes, vessels in the South China Sea are also by the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty. Let's go to the next slide. Let me get which one this is. Next one, please. Malaysia also begins to move into the Spratly Islands at this time, and for much the same reason. It's late 1970s. The third UN conference on the law of the sea is almost done. Everyone knows that there's now going to be a thing called the exclusive economic zone that extends 200 miles from your coast, and that the continental shelf will extend 200 miles from your coast. In 1979, Malaysia issues a new map of its continental shelf that looks like this. And then it begins to survey all of the Spratly Islands within that continental shelf, because Malaysia wants to drill for oil and gas on the shelf. And it's worried that if the Filipinos or Vietnamese or Chinese occupy one of these islands or reefs, they will prevent Malaysian drilling. This is the beginning of Malaysian activity in the South China Sea. Let's look to the next slide. All of this remains somewhat academic until 1988. So the disputes are largely frozen from the 70s on, because despite all the fears, Vietnam does not invade the other Spratlys. And China does not come down to the Spratlys because it doesn't have the capability to. But from 1979 on, China begins a large naval modernization, one of the 4 modernizations promoted by President Deng Xiaoping. And by the late 1980s, China suddenly has a real navy and a real Coast Guard and a real state surveillance fleet. And they're able to go down into the Spratly Islands at the end of 1987 and begin scoping things out. And in 1988, China occupies its first island in the Spratlys. It then occupies several more. It targets the Vietnamese-held portions of the Spratlys because it doesn't want to pick a fight with the Filipinos and risk bringing in the Americans. The Vietnamese try to block Chinese occupation. So for every island China occupies, Vietnam occupies one. They play this game of checkers until May of 1988, when they both land on Johnson Reef at the same time. The Vietnamese get there about 2 hours before Chinese commandos wade onto the reef. There's a short battle. The Chinese sink the Vietnamese boats on the scene, and then they kill all 66 Vietnamese commandos who are stranded on the island. That is the Battle of Johnson Reef, and it marks China's entry into the Spratly Islands. Now, the same modernization effort that allowed China to finally occupy some of the Spratlys also led China to begin to believe that it was capable of claiming not just the islands, but the waters, the seabed, and the airspace of the South China Sea as well. So from the 1980s on, you begin to get Chinese claims that go beyond the islands. They begin to violate international maritime law in ways that are very worrying to the United States and to Indonesia. Okay. So in 1985, China begins to subsidize fishing in the Spratly Islands for the first time. So Chinese fishermen show up in the South China Sea, in the Spratly Islands, for the first time since World War II, because their government pays them to be there. In 1989, those same forces begin to operate over 1991, they begin to fish over the Sunda Shelf off Natuna Baysar for the first time, because the Chinese government pays them to be there. This becomes known in Chinese as the Southwest Fishing Ground. In 1994, the Chinese Ministry of Agriculture publishes a map of Chinese fishing grounds in the South China Sea that matches the 9-dash line for the first time, showing the Indonesian EEZ to be part of China's historic fishing grounds. And as a result, in 1995, the government of Indonesia, for the first time, admits that China is claiming part of the Indonesian EEZ and that they have a dispute. In the meantime, Indonesia is also trying to manage the dispute as best it can. In 1990, Indonesia sponsors the first workshop on managing the South China Sea, which is the brainchild of Ambassador Hashim Jalal, who had helped lead the UNCLOS negotiations. Sorry, I feel like I'm going to have to start yelling. In 1990, Indonesia begins sponsoring the first joint workshops on the South China Sea, which are the brainchild of Ambassador Hashim Jalal, who had helped run the UNCLOS negotiations on behalf of Indonesia, and who would soon become the first first president of the International Seabed Authority. Those workshops continue to this day, although they are much, much smaller than they were in the 1990s. And after more than 30 years, they have led to absolutely no progress in managing the South China Sea disputes, despite the best efforts of Indonesia, because China has persistently rejected any practical cooperation through the workshop process. Can we flip to the next slide, please? Okay. All right. Next slide. By the 1990s, China has very firmly decided that it is now claiming all rights over waters, seabed, and airspace in the South China Sea, not just the islands. And so for both Indonesia and the United States, the South China Sea now matters in a way it didn't before. It's no longer about sovereignty, it's about the rules. China by 1992 is objecting to all oil and gas exploration in the South China Sea that it is not involved in, including this block here, which it claims off the coast of Vietnam, about 900 miles from China. Let's flip to the next slide. By 1996, China draws baselines illegally around the Paracel Islands and says that no foreign vessels or planes may go through that. Now, by the rules of archipelagic baselines, which Indonesia negotiated at UNCLOS 3, and which originally came from the ideas of Prime Minister Juanda Kartawijaya, if an archipelagic state claims baselines, those baselines cannot exceed a land-to-water ratio of 1 to 9, meaning that you can't have more than 9 times as much water as you have land inside the baselines. One, China is not an archipelagic state, so it cannot claim these baselines at all. But two, the proportion, the ratio within the paracels is over 1,000 to 1. That is over, well, I don't want to sit here and do the math, over 100 times the allowed ratio under UNCLOS. And in 1998, all of this comes together when China issues its law on the exclusive economic zone, in which it for the first time claims historic rights throughout the entire South China Sea. Let's flip to the next slide. Next. In 2009, China famously sends the 9-dash line to the UN. This is in reaction to the continental shelf claims of Vietnam and Malaysia that year, in which China responds by saying that it claims everything within the 9-dash line. And in 2010, the Indonesian government sends a note verbal to the UN objecting to this claim, laying out all of Indonesia's objections, essentially saying that the 9-dash line is illegal. Next slide, please. This kicks off more than a decade now of steady escalation in the South China Sea. In 2012, China seizes Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines. The Philippines reacts the next year by filing an arbitration case under UNCLOS at the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which it will eventually win. China retaliates by launching its island building campaign at the end of 2013, in which it builds over 3,000 acres of new land and 3 new air and naval bases in the Spratly Islands in the span of just about 2 years. Next slide, please. Next slide. In building those islands, China intentionally digs up 15,000 acres of coral reef to create the sand, and another 25,000 acres through clam harvesting. So China intentionally destroys 40,000 acres of coral reef in the world's most productive fishing ground. Next slide. That, among many other things, is ruled illegal by the Permanent Court of Arbitration in 2016. In 2016, the Philippines wins, and the court rejects all Chinese claims outside of these tiny bubbles. The bubbles of territorial sea around the Spratly Islands are ruled the only things that are legally disputed in the South China Sea. Next slide. Which means that this should be what EEZs and continental shelves in the South China Sea look like. But as we all know, China has not abided by the 2016 ruling. What this means for Indonesia is that Chinese fishermen continue to operate in the Indonesian exclusive economic zone illegally, sometimes violently preventing Bakamla from arresting Chinese fishermen. And last year, for the first time, the China Coast Guard tried to prevent Indonesia from drilling for oil and gas in its own waters on its continental shelf north of Natuna Besar. Next slide. And I will conclude there, but there's plenty more in the book, including what we should do about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Well, it's very interesting that you elaborate the history or the claims from one country to another until it become now like that. Okay, without further ado, allow me to introduce you Mr. Haris Nugroho, who is a very dear and close friend of mine. He's a veteran diplomat. And when in his active year in the foreign ministry, he served in the Directorate General of Legal and Treaties Affairs and was involved in so many conferences, be it bilateral and negotiation, be it bilateral, regional, and multilateral, and especially in the field of the law of the sea. He's currently the head of the Department of International Law and Law of the Sea at the Faculty of Law of the University of Pancasila, and concurrently also the Executive Secretary of the International Office of the University of Pancasila. So with this, I give you the floor, Pak Haris.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Wirana. Let me first begin by extending my gratitude, first of all, to Pak Rektor, Professor Eddy Hendratno, and also Pak Dekan, Professor Eddy Pratomo, for giving us introduction and also opening remarks. And I also would like to thank Professor Adi Saptomo for his presence in this room, and also Ms. Claire Clegg and to Prita for coming here from the United States Embassy in Jakarta. I think we have just listened attentively the presentation made by Pak Gregory. It's very interesting. He described and also elaborate the background, the historical background until the very current development of the South China Sea, particularly in relation with the overlapping claims on the area. And then my presentation is actually will revolve around the ruling on the awards made rendered by the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Just a brief overview, because if we look at the awards, actually it consists of around 500 pages, I think. So I just make a brief overview to make us a little bit easier to understand. So, so my title is the South China Sea Arbitration, a brief overview. This is regarding the Permanent Court of Arbitration rulings on the claim or claim that made or initiated by the Philippine government. Next page, please. Yeah, actually, I just want to, I do not want to duplicate your presentation, Pak Greg, but I think it's not, we cannot avoid it to have some, like in South China Sea itself, overlapping presentation, not only overlapping claims, but also overlapping presentation. Yeah, if we look at the map here, South China Sea, some of us, or perhaps media or expert, call South China Sea as hotspot. So hotspot is not only in Middle East area, in the area of conflict between Israelis and Palestine, and very recently Ukraine, yeah, it's also becoming a hotspot. But this is sea hotspot. Very interesting. I listened very attentively. Presentation by Pak Gregory. Very interesting, and he made the presentation very detailed. But I just want to make a brief overview with regard to the South China Sea as hotspot. In terms of geopolitics, it is a very significant role in the in Indo-Pacific. And then also South China contains rates of living and non-living resources, fishing grounds, and also some undiscovered oil and gas. And then also South China Sea is the site of several complex territorial claims among the littoral states, as mentioned by Gregory, China, Vietnam, and then also the Philippines, Taiwan, Brunei, Malaysia, and then some also even encroach, as Pak Gregory mentioned, encroach the Indonesian economic exclusive zone. So this is very much the region that causes potential conflict and also tension within the region and even throughout the Indo-Pacific region. And then I would like to briefly touch on the settlement of dispute under international law. If we look at the United Nations Charter, particularly Article 2, Paragraph 3, and also Article 33, Paragraph 1, it provides in the Charter provided that settlement of disputes must be done or settled peacefully in such a way that international peace and security are not threatened. That is the most important principle, because the drafters of the charter, I think, learn more from the World War II. So how to avoid the war or the conflict that can then develop into what do you call it, armed conflict, something like that. So dispute must be settled peacefully and in such a way that international peace and security are not threatened. And then I try to make two categories. First category is the peaceful settlement of dispute is through political means, or we also call it as a diplomatic means. First is negotiation. Negotiations involve directly the parties concerned without involving the third party or third parties. And then there is also inquiry. Inquiry will involve a commission of inquiry that will also include the third party. And then mediation also involves third party, and conciliation, and also international and regional organizations. These procedures or this means of settlement of disputes categorized as peaceful settlement of dispute through political means or diplomatic means. It is similar. And then the second category is legal means, through arbitration and also adjudication. Arbitration can be divided into two. There is a ad hoc arbitration. That means after parties come to an agreement, then establish an ad hoc arbitration. But also we have, as we know, that in the case between Philippines and China, the Philippines initiated or bring the claim to the Permanent Court of Arbitration. This is the permanent one. There is ad hoc, and there is also permanent arbitration. PCA was founded long time ago in 1899, but still in existence until today. And then adjudication, we see, we know a lot. There are many adjudication settlement. For instance, this very famous one, International Court of Justice, and then also International Criminal Court, and then in the disputes on international trade, for instance, we see there is a dispute settlement body under WTO. And then this legal means is legally binding. So there are two peaceful settlement of disputes through political means and through legal means. Political means is not legally binding, but legal means legally binding. And then I will narrowing down into dispute settlement in the law of the sea. This is, in my opinion, very interesting. We see that United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, 1982, as called by the president of the third conference on the law of the sea at that time, Ambassador Tomiko. Ambassador Tomiko called this convention as the constitution of the ocean. Why he called it as the constitution of the ocean? Because this constitution contains a very comprehensive development of international law of the sea at the time, around in 1982 something. Because convention is the first convention that include the agreement among the parties in the conference with regard to the breadth of territorial sea, 12 nautical miles. And then also, as Pak Gregory mentioned about archipelagic principle, archipelagic state that proposed by Indonesia and also the Philippines, Fiji, and other archipelagic states. This is a new principle that included in this convention. Before that, in the Law of the Sea Conference in Geneva, 1958 and also 1960, the agreement on the 12 miles of the territorial sea breadth had not been reached or agreed upon. And then also archipelagic principle. Also provision regarding the area, the seabed or seafloor beyond the national jurisdiction. This is also first time included in the multilateral convention. And then also the most important thing, also the establishment of International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea that have its seats now in Hamburg, Germany. And then that we are going to discuss here is about the settlement of dispute under the convention. The convention provided a two-tier or two-level of settlement of dispute. First is through the peaceful means of their own choice between the parties concerned. And then second one is about the mandatory character of this convention. There is a compulsory procedures apply when the parties fail to settle their disputes by recourse to the procedures set out in Section 1. Actually, Section 1 just reaffirm what has been provided in the Article 2 and Article 33 in the United Nations Charter. The peaceful settlement of disputes must be through peaceful means and through procedures that I have been mentioned earlier: negotiation, consultation, inquiry, arbitration, and also through adjudication. This is settlement dispute, international dispute under the law of the sea. And now we proceed to the next. Now we come to what Philippine claims in the South China Sea in the arbitral tribunal. Actually, I can summarize into four matters concerning the relation between the Philippines and China in the South China Sea. First is the historic rights. China call it as 9-dash line based on its historic rights. This is very interesting Because if we study about the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, actually, I think it was discussed in the conference, in the United Nations conference, the third conference. But historic rights, I think it was rejected. So it is not included or not agreed upon by the states at that time. So United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea doesn't really provide about or even not recognize about the historic rights that claimed by China. And then the claim by Philippines also relates to maritime entitlement in the South China Sea, and then also the status of maritime features like rocks or maybe reefs, and then low tide elevation, something like that. That is very technical in the law of the sea, particularly in the delimitation of maritime boundary. And also maritime entitlement that they are capable of generating. For instance, islands that cannot sustain human habitation, cannot generate EEZ or economic exclusive zone, and also continental shelf. And also, lastly, the claims made by Philippines is regarding or concerning the lawfulness of certain action by China, as I think Pak Gregory already mentioned so many times. Chinese action in Philippine opinion is in contravention with the Law of the Sea Convention. And then we should also try to understand what is China's position on the matter of tribunal's jurisdiction. China, of course, did not accept or participate in the arbitration. And then China also said that actually this is lawful rights, as well as in China opinion, this is also in accordance with international law. And also China mentioned and also always insist that tribunal does not have jurisdiction. And then also its corresponding reasoning. It also clarifies that China position of non-acceptance, non-participation. And China also said that it has legal basis in international law. China's government also clarified that because China not participate in the tribunal, China may issued a position paper. In the position paper also made clear that statement and document issued by China shall by no means be interpreted as China's participation in the arbitral proceeding in any form. Also, China also mentioned that the dispute must be peacefully settled through negotiation and consultation, means directly between the parties concerned. As a party to the Law of the Sea Convention, China also, with regard to the compulsory procedures, this is about the compulsory procedures, China only accepts the procedure when certain conditions are met. First, the dispute should be limited to those concerning interpretation and application of the convention. So if the dispute concerning territorial sovereignty or historic right or outlying archipelagos of a continental shelf in general international law should be excluded from the dispute that fall under the convention. And then further condition is the exhaustion of dispute settlement procedure. So the settlement procedure must be already exhaustive, that already chosen by the parties concerned. And then compulsory dispute procedure are not applicable. This is regarding to the China opinion, are not applicable to the issue concerning territorial sovereignty in South China Sea and also maritime delimitation. So China emphasizes more on the procedural matters, so not on the merit of the claim, because perhaps China realized that the weakness of its claim towards South China Sea based on, for instance, historic rights, because it is in contravention with the convention. So China focused on the jurisdiction to undermine the claim that already initiated by the Philippines. And then what the tribunal's decision on its jurisdiction. This is, I think, very interesting for lawyers like students here in front of us. The tribunal relies on two provisions of the Law of the Sea Convention, which address the situation if a party objects to its jurisdiction and also decline to participate in the proceeding. The tribunal, for instance, referring to Article 288 of the Law of the Sea Convention and also Article 9 of Annex 7 to the Convention. Article 288 provides that in the event of a dispute as to whether a court or tribunal has jurisdiction, the matter shall be settled by decision of that court or tribunal. This is if we look at commercial arbitration, yeah, in France, they call it as compétence de la compétence, that the court or the tribunal has jurisdiction in this matter and can decide. And then very interesting in Article 9 of Annex 7 to the convention, which sets forth that if one of the parties to the dispute does not appear, yeah, once again, does not appear before the tribunal or fails to defend its case, the other party may request the tribunal to continue the proceedings. Not only continue the proceedings, but also to make or to render an award. This is very interesting article. Absence or failure of a party to defend its case shall not constitute a bar, so cannot prevent to the proceedings. So before making its award, the arbitral tribunal must also satisfy itself not only that it has jurisdiction over the disputes, but also that the claim in this regard, claim by Philippines, must be well-founded based on fact and also based on the law. So there are two things here in this articles. First is about the jurisdiction, and then second is about the merits of the case itself, must be based in fact and law. And then we proceed further to the, oh, okay, thank you, sir. Yeah, this is a dispute concerning the interpretation and application of convention. Yeah. Tribunal, of course, rejected the argument set out in the China position paper that China said that actually about territorial sovereignty, but the tribunal rejected. Even though tribunal accepted that the parties, I mean the China and the Philippines, have dispute concerning sovereignty of islands in the South China Sea, but held that matters submitted by the Philippines actually do not concern sovereignty. And then also tribunal rejected the argument set in the China's position paper that the parties dispute is actually about maritime boundary delimitation. And also the tribunal found it that the dispute actually is regarding whether a state has entitlement to a maritime zone is distinct or different from the delimitation of maritime zone in the area in which they overlap. So finally, tribunal had that Philippine submission reflected a dispute concerning the convention. So claim made by Philippines or initiated by the Philippines is actually valid and under the jurisdiction of tribunal and also under the scope of the convention. And then because this is the time is very limited, yeah. I just want to make a brief summary that the tribunal decision on the merits of the Philippine claims, I noted there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5 different things that decided by the tribunal. First is about the 9-dash line and China's claim to historic rights and also status of features and then lawfulness of Chinese actions, harm to marine environment, and also aggravation of disputes. Tribunal concluded that historical navigation and fishing by China in the waters of the South China Sea, it's actually represented exercise of ISIS freedom rather than historic rights. And there was no evidence that China had historically exercised exclusive control over the waters of the South China Sea or prevented other states from exploiting their resource. And tribunal also noted that the reef have been heavily modified, as Pak Gregory mentioned, by land reclamation and construction. Recall the convention classifies features on their natural condition. And then lawfulness of China's action. Tribunal concluded that China had violated the Philippines' sovereign rights and economic exclusive zone by interfering with Philippine fishing and petroleum exploration, and then second, constructing artificial islands, and thirdly, failing to prevent Chinese fishermen from fishing in the zone. And also, tribunal considered the effect on the marine environment of China's large-scale land reclamation and construction of artificial islands at 7 features in the Spratly Islands and found that China had caused severe harm to the coral reef environment. Also, aggravation of the dispute, the tribunal found that China's recent large-scale land reclamation and construction of artificial islands was incompatible with the obligation on a state during dispute resolution proceedings. So, and then what is the future conduct of the parties? This is also very important after the awards by the tribunal. Tribunal noted that both the Philippines and China have repeatedly accepted that the convention and the general obligation of good faith define and regulate their conduct. Tribunal recalled that it is a fundamental principle of international law that bad faith is not presumed, and noted that Article 11 of Annex 7 to the convention set out that the award shall be complied with by the parties to the dispute. I think that's all of my presentation, and now I give back the floor to Pak Rana.
Thank you very much for the both speakers. I think we come to the question and answers session addressed to the speakers. You have already been briefed a long history of the progress of the large South China Sea conflict by Mr. Gregory B.Poling, and also Pak Haris gave an overview on the tribunal proceedings. And is there anybody who would pose any questions? Please mention your name and to whom your question is addressed. But before that, as a moderator, perhaps I can use the privilege to ask some, well, practical questions. to Mr. Gregory and maybe later to Pak Haris. Well, we all know the process of the counterclaim and the potential dispute in the area of South China Sea after all these years. And I think the process of negotiation and the process of trying to adhere for the existing law in the international law and especially the law of the Sea Convention has kind of been exhausted. At the same time, I think both parties or the claimants restrained to sort of so far to have a real conflict on this matter, except one or two incidents. But of course, it can escalate. Now, in your opinion, is this because despite of this claim of but the economic relations in the area, China, vis-a-vis China, is much important, you know, to and of course at the same time the rule, the how do I say it? The United States so far being a country outside the region, can it give some concrete, you know, solution or on this conflict, except well, forgive me to say the rhetoric or just giving the blame game, you know, to the other side. That is perhaps my question. What, in your observance, sort of a practical solution to this matter? Thank you.
Thank you, Pak. So really two questions, right? So first question, why don't countries push back more against China? Yeah, it's because of their economic ties to China. Why hasn't Indonesia endorsed the 2016 arbitration award? Because of Indonesia's economic ties to China. Same is true for Malaysia and Brunei and Singapore. Other than Vietnam and the Philippines, most of ASEAN wants to keep this issue in the background. The problem has been that while China has been very good at not using military force, because Beijing does not want to provoke a fight with the United States by accidentally triggering US defense obligations to the Philippines, China has used its other forms of coercion, its Coast Guard in particular, and also its maritime militia, to make it all but impossible for civilians to operate. So since finishing the islands, the island bases, which everything on the islands was built by 2018, China has begun to deploy about 300 fishing militia boats and about a dozen Coast Guard boats in the Spratlys every day, meaning that China is everywhere, all at once now. So every oil and gas operation for the last 4 years by Malaysia, Vietnam, or the Philippines has been immediately harassed by the China Coast Guard. Fish stocks have almost collapsed. Fish stocks are down about 90% in the South China Sea. The Philippines has been unable to resupply its soldiers at its smallest outpost on the Second Thomas Shoal. Just about 3 weeks ago, a Chinese Coast Guard vessel pointed its deck guns at a Philippine civilian resupply vessel. All of this makes it too risky for countries to assert their legal rights. And if you don't assert your legal rights, then they don't exist. So increasingly, China is de facto in control of historic rights in the South China Sea, even though nobody officially recognizes it. I do think we've hit a turning point, at least for Indonesia. So Malaysia still wants to keep quiet. But last year, when China tried to block drilling at the tuna block off Natuna Baysar. The response by TNIAL and by Bakamla was stronger than anything we've seen for the last 10 years. The public statements, particularly by the Defense Ministry and TNI, have been much stronger. I think at least for Minister Prabowo, for General Andika, a corner has been turned. China is now treating Indonesia the way it has treated the Philippines and Vietnam for 20 years. And Indonesia is not comfortable with that. So I think we are going to see greater pushback. Now, what about the US role? Well, look, the United States does not take a position on sovereignty, and I don't think we should. It is not for the United States, right? We're not Britain in the 19th century. We're not going to come in and draw lines on a map and say who owns what rock. Our job is to defend the Philippines as a treaty ally and to ensure that China pays a price on the international stage for bad behavior, because the United States does not accept that China gets to set its own rules. The problem is that the United States cannot do any of that alone. This is not 1995. The United States is not the sole great power in the world anymore. If other countries will not stand up to China, then the United States cannot do it for them. That was the problem under the Duterte government in the Philippines. No country will defend a country that will not defend itself.
Pak Haris has a comment. And before that, Pak Haris, well, the conclusion of the tribunal said that both the Philippines and China repeatedly accepted that the convention and the general obligation of good faith define and regulate their conduct, while, as we know, China's argument is all on the contrary to this convention. So, is this just, well, empty paper of the conclusion of the tribunal?
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador Wirana. Yeah, it is interesting to note what argument already mentioned, consistently mentioned or expressed by China. China always said that it's attaches a great importance to the convention, and also China always mentioned that China is rule-based country. If there is something on dispute, always based on the rule. But in practice, we can see a different kind of action that actually did not reflect what already mentioned by China, that China attached great importance to the convention and also to the international law, for instance. And then we also understand that China until today, I think will also in the future consistently will reject and not accept the awards by the PCA. And also China try its best, but by employing the political power and also economic power, as you mentioned before. And we know during the COVID-19 that almost Southeast Asian countries are dependent on the Sinovac and also vaccine made by China. So even myself, I was vaccinated by Sinovac. So this is a very complicated one actually, but because China economic power is very, very strong at the moment. So China can try to maximize its influence on its political power and also economic power.
Thank you. So I give the floor. Who will pose a question first? I think the gentleman there. Can you mention your name and to whom your question will be addressed? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. My name is Muhammad Farhan. I'm from the Law Faculty of Pancasila University, and I would like to ask a question to Mr. Gregory B.Poling. My question is, as we know that every country in the world have a same and equal sovereignty. Do you consider that America's presence, the military presence in Southeast Asia could be a threat to the sovereignty of the Southeast Asian countries? And do you consider that the action of big countries in Southeast Asia is the new form of the new colonialism and imperialism? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak. No, next question. The U.S. presence in Asia, U.S. military presence in Asia, rests fundamentally on U.S. presence in Japan, U.S. presence in Singapore, and maybe future presence in the Philippines. All three with the willing participation of those states. It does not violate the sovereignty of Japan for Japan to say that it wants to host U.S. forces as a way to deter aggression. That is Japan's sovereign decision to make. It was the Philippines' sovereign decision to kick U.S. forces out in 1991. And if the Philippines chooses to welcome them back on a rotational basis through the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, that is the Philippines' sovereign decision as well. It's not for other states to try to dictate the sovereign decision of other countries. Now, whether or not, well, so to your big question, does the activity of great powers prevent new colonialism? Well, no, I don't think that's a helpful framing. Because I don't think China has an interest in colonizing states. I think China has an interest in reestablishing a modern tributary system in which Indonesia will ask China for permission before it does anything on the world stage. And so will every other country in Southeast Asia. China very clearly has an interest in establishing a zone within Asia in which international law does not apply, in which China sets all rules. It is already doing that in the South China Sea. It is doing that with regard to Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait, doing it in the East China Sea and on the Himalayan border in Ladakh with India. China is seeking to revise the international system in a way that places China at the center of Asia. And that is clearly not of interest to its smaller neighbors. If it was, they wouldn't be welcoming the U.S. back into the region. The Philippines, Vietnam, Singapore, Japan, so on, welcome the United States out of fear of China. Not because of anything the U.S. is doing, really. The U.S. is pretty bad lately at diplomacy, you might have noticed. But China's even worse.
Good morning and thank you, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Ramban Krishna Wisananda and I would like to ask question to Mr. Haris Nugroho. So by looking at the China statement that disregard the Hague Tribunal decision on the South China Sea dispute between China and Philippines, what are the international law or sanctions that can be imposed to China who has disregarded that decision? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So if I'm not mistaken, your question is what can be done if China does not comply with the words, the ruling by the PCA. Yeah, actually, this is the problem of international law, actually. If a state fail to comply or fail to obey the decision, and what should be done? If we look at the ICJ decision, we compare it with the International Court of Justice decision, Article 94. Article 94 provides its member of United Nations undertake to comply with the decision of the International Court of Justice in any case to which it is a party. And then paragraph 2, if any party to a case fails to perform the obligation incumbent upon it under a judgment rendered by the court, the other party may have recourse to the Security Council. Yeah, this is an ICJ decision, which may, if it deemed necessary, make a recommendation or decide upon measures to be taken to give effect to the judgment. This is very interesting article actually, because Article 60 mentioned that the judgment by ICJ is final and without appeal. But in the Article 94, may recourse to the Security Council. It means that can also decide, can be enforced by political body. So this is a decision made by judicial body, but the enforcement can be done by the political body. This is very interesting, this two articles. But in the PCA award, there is no such mechanism. There is no enforcement mechanism of the award. This is the problem of international law. But we have to also recall that the sanction, if a party not comply, is not only through something like law enforcement, but also like public opinion. You know that public opinion now is not in China's side, more on the Philippine side. This is also a sort of sanction, if it were not law enforcement, like as mentioned, like in the case of International Court of Justice. The public opinion also pressuring China. And then also this is, if I may check an article that I bring now. Yeah, actually the unanimous ruling of the PCA or the tribunal in the dispute between the Philippines and China is a landmark decision under the United Nations law of the sea, and represent a strong rebuke of China's expansive claim to maritime territory in South China Sea. And also the PCA's ruling serve not only as technical legal decision binding upon the parties, China and Philippines, but also a broader message. This is very important, yeah. Broader message concerning the peaceful settlement of disputes in South China Sea pursuant to rule-based international order. So this is not only a technically legal decision, but also give effect on the public opinion and also position of the Philippines, and also this is also very beneficial to our position, Indonesian position, that everything must be settled through international law, particularly law of the sea convention. Then China has decided by the PCA does not comply with the convention. This is not only enforcement as compared with, for instance, in the domestic court, yeah, enforcement, there is a police, there is executive body who can enforce. But in the permanent court of arbitration, there is no mechanism body to enforce a decision. But the failure to enforce is not failure on the PCA, but the failure of China not to comply. The failure of China as the member of international community not to comply the tribunal decision. I think that is my answer. Perhaps Pak Gregory would like.
I'd like to really highlight the point made that the reason that international law works is because international public opinion imposes costs for violating the law. Nobody wants to be North Korea, right? If you want to get things done, you need other countries to cooperate. If you are seen as a rule breaker, that's especially important for global leaders. China, the US, the United Kingdom, Russia, they want the country to go along with it. And that gets harder and harder the more you violate law. So over the last century, more than 90% of all arbitrals have eventually been complied with without any enforcement mechanism in any of them. And that's because in the weight of international opinion imposes its own cost. So the United States lost an ICJ decision to Nicaragua in 1986. By the mid-90s, The U.S. had lost 3 UN votes in order to comply with that rule. Over 150 countries have voted against the U.S. The United States finally complied because it was just taking up too much of our time. The Russians complied with an ITLO's decision. They lost to the Netherlands in 2000. The British last year lost a vote by over 100 votes in the UN to give back the Chocolate Archipelago to the Maldives. And I guarantee they were just commercial, and they will eventually comply. Where are the votes on China? In the whole world, 9 countries have said that China should comply with you. 9. Indonesia is not one of those countries. Why is it that 150 countries are willing to vote against the United States? 100 plus are willing to vote against the UK, but nobody's willing to vote against China. The economic cost that they believe is involved. So as long as that's the case, China will never comply with this thing because it pays no price for non-compliance.
Okay, thank you very much for the. Is there any question? How about the ladies? Don't stay quiet. Is there any ladies who want to pose questions? Oh, you want to pose question? Okay.
My name is Grace Clegg from the U.S. Embassy in Jakarta, and my question comes from my previous time as a student and as someone who in Washington worked on South China Sea issues, not as representative from the U.S. government. I'm curious, Greg, if you could tell us your insight of the impact of the election in the Philippines and how that might change Philippines' response to the rolling on Pancasila 7 years ago.
It is hard to overstate how much damage the Duterte government did to the Philippines' legal position internationally. Remember, the arbitral award came down on July 12th of 2016. Rodrigo Duterte was inaugurated on June 30th, 13 days too soon. Had the Aquino government still been in place on July 12, 2016, I guarantee that over 50 countries would have issued public statements supporting the and Indonesia probably would have been one of them. Because Ambassador Havas Elgraseno had been in Washington a month before that and pledged that publicly, on camera, pledged that Indonesia would support the award. And then Indonesia didn't. Indonesia didn't, just like 50 other countries who had publicly pledged for it didn't, because the Duterte government didn't ask them. Again, as I said earlier, no country is going to take a position that angers China, that causes China to punish them on behalf of the Philippines. The Philippines won't stand up for itself. And so now we have a new government in the Philippines. And while the Marcos government has said nice things about China, guess what? The Marcos government also issued a statement on July 12th, the anniversary of the arbitration award, demanding Chinese compliance. The Marcos administration has swore that it's not going to give up 1 inch of its territory in the South China Sea. And it's taking significant steps to rebuild and tighten the alliance with the United States, probably to include a return of some small number of U.S. rotational forces into the Philippines, all because the Marcos government believes that the Duterte government's policy was an abject failure. For 6 years, the Duterte government agreed to set aside the arbitration in exchange for Chinese investment. And what happened? China did not provide investment and still continued to take Philippine rights in South China Sea. So they lost on both counts. So I am cautiously optimistic that the new Philippine government will be more proactive. But I will say this, given how much China has come to control most day-to-day activity in the South China Sea, time is running. If the Philippines does not get it right during this presidency, they never will. They will lose their constitutional.
Yes, my name is Sarah. I would like to ask a question to Pak Haris. What is the importance of the PCA decisions on the legal jurisdiction over SCS? Thank you. What is the importance of the PCA decisions on the legal jurisdictions over SES? Yes. So, sorry.
Yeah, thank you for your question, Sarah. I think the most important thing from the award rendered by the PCA is that we should settle the dispute through by peaceful means, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation. And then whenever the award already rendered, the parties concerned must comply. This is, I think, not only applicable to the parties concerned in this regard, China and the Philippines, but also this can also reflect to other parties concerned in South China Sea disputes. All the littoral states concerned, I think, also must respect also this decision, even though not affect directly to them. The principle that the merit that already decided by the tribunal, first of all, based on the law of the sea convention, and then also international law, and then after the decision already made and rendered by the court or tribunal, the parties concerned must comply. So this is a good example that if there is a country fail to defend itself, but in the United Nations Convention there is also a means or procedure to enforce compulsory jurisdiction. This is very important. That is in the development of international law of the sea, particularly in this South China Sea area. This is, I think, the good example of how parties should comply with the court or tribunal decision. This is, I think, a good example for all of us, including Indonesia, and the decision also, I think, will give great advantage as well to our Indonesian position in this regard. We should adhere or comply with the United Nations Convention on the law of the sea. If we are going to settle disputes, or we would like to delimit our maritime boundaries with neighboring countries, and if there is no any agreement, we should refer to the procedure that already I mentioned before, through peaceful means, whether through political means or judicial means. So the lesson that we can learn from PCA decision is how to comply with the tribunal decision. I think that is very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there any other question? Maybe the last one? No? So then I then close this session. So please give a round of applause to both our speakers. And before concluding, I as a moderator, thank you very much for your participations. And of course, both speakers who has already been giving sort of a thorough brief illustration from the how to manage and mitigate conflict in the tension and the historical. And of course, I would also again thank the United States Embassy in Jakarta for their contribution, for their support. And I would just say thank you, come again, because we at the International Office represent the whole university. So perhaps today's event is of course in collaboration with the Faculty of Law, but there are 6 other faculties who are looking forward, to have such activity like this. Once again, I thank you very much. And now I give back the mic to our MC. Thank you.
Thank you, Bapak Mulya Wirana. Before we end this webinar, let's listen first to the closing remarks that will be delivered by Miss Grace Clegg as the Assistant Cultural Attaché from U.S. Embassy for Republic Indonesia. Please come forward, Miss Grace. Di sana.
Selamat pagi Bapak Ibu. Atas nama Kedutaan Besar Amerika Serikat di Jakarta, terima kasih atas sambutan yang hangat dan keramaan Anda semua pagi ini. Kami senang sekali berada di sini hari ini. I would like to especially thank Rector Professor Eddy Toet, Dean Eddy Pratomo, our moderator and discussant, Ambassador Mulya and Secretary Harris, and the entire Faculty of Law at Pancasila University for hosting us today. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Greg for sharing his research and his insights with all of us, and as well as all of the mahasiswa and mahasiswi who joined us this morning. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. Now, I know that I am the last thing standing between everyone and a wonderful lunch that has been provided. So I will just add one more thing. Unfortunately, it has been a couple of years since we've been able to visit Pancasila University. And I just want to say that it won't be the last. We really are looking forward to re-engaging, reconnecting as we come out of this pandemic era. And so stay tuned for more opportunities. There are more speakers, more experts on a range of subjects from the future of higher education to STEM. So we're looking forward to it. We're looking forward to seeing all of you again. And I guess I'll just end there again by saying, terima kasih sekali dan sampai jumpa lagi ya. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much for Miss Grace Clegg for the closing remarks.
On behalf of the Faculty of Law, Pancasila University, and the organizing committee, we would like to express our deepest thanks and appreciation to the moderator, Mr. Mulya Wirana, for guiding the fruitful and productive discussion in today's webinar. We also extend our heartfelt thanks and felicitation to the speakers and participants who attended both offline and online today. And that's the end of today's event. Stay
healthy, stay safe, and stay
happy.
happy. Salam Pancasila. Kami meminta seluruh mahasiswa dari bagian hukum internasional untuk ke depan dan foto bersama dengan Pak Mulya Wirana, dengan Bapak Haris, and with the speakers, Mr. Poling and Miss Clegg, to take a picture together with the students from our International Law Department.